I knew a man named after mice. He really liked sniffing the spice. He offered a trade for the spice that I saved, but it just wasn't worth at that price. Hey guys, James here again with another game review, and today I'm going to be talking about Dune Spice Wars, a new 4X real-time strategy hybrid which allows you to play as one of the factions vying for control of the desert planet Arrakis. In Spice Wars, your goal is to capture territory, generate resources, and compete with other factions to see who can control the ever-important spice melange. If I had to compare this game to other games, I'd say it's like if you combined Off-World Trading Company with Risk. I've heard it's a lot like Northgard, another game developed by the same devs, but I've actually never played Northgard, so I can't really speak to that personally. Overall, I've actually really enjoyed playing Dune Spice Wars, and I think it does give me that just one more turn sort of feeling that you get when playing a lot of 4X games. But since, at the time of this review, the game is still in early access, I do think there is quite a bit of room to grow. There is a bunch to go over here, so without further ado, let's dive into this review. So, before you start a game, the first thing you need to do is select your faction. At the time of this review, there are currently 4 factions. There's the Diplomatic Atreides, the Aggressive Harkonnen, the Cunning Smugglers, and the Sneaky Fremen. Each faction has a unique leader and their own special faction bonuses, as well as 4 potential counselors you can select from. On any run, you have to select 2 of the 4 counselors to bring with you, each with their own unique boost that will change your approach and abilities. For example, with House Atreides, you could appoint Lady Jessica, who can force other factions into special treaties, and Duncan Idaho, who can help expand and develop your relationships with the locals. There's a variety of different counselors, and the ones you choose can make your life easier or more challenging, if you're into that. So then, once you set your faction, you can tweak settings about the world and game, and boom, you're in. So once you're in, you start off with your home base and an ornithopter, which acts as your first scout unit. Your first priority is finding the spice. Spice is the most precious substance in the universe. The spice extends life. The spice expands consciousness. The spice is vital to space travel. You want to start harvesting spice because it's not only sold for Solari, the currency of the world, but you'll also need to store some in reserve so you can pay off your periodic spice tax. Throughout the game, you can adjust how much of the spice you're harvesting is saved and how much is sold, with the price of spice fluctuating throughout the game. Saving some spice is also important because you'll never know when a sandworm might appear and threaten to devour your harvester, stopping spice production temporarily. You're going to want to scout that first zone in order to identify a village. You then need to convert the village to your control, which most of the time is done by attacking it with your troops, although the Atreides can actually do it passively if they want. You produce all of your units from your main base in a nice little menu on the side here. Once your forces are ready and the village is revealed, you'll then face off against the local militia in the village before being able to take control of it. Then, once land is under your control, you can then start to make buildings and to begin harvesting that good. And honestly, most of the core game revolves around this 4X style concept of identifying zones and capturing them so you can exploit them for profit. As you discover and capture more and more of the map, you'll find that certain swaths of land will provide boosts to different types of resources, and in Spice Wars, there's quite a lot of different resources you'll need to manage throughout the game. First, you have physical resources. There's plastine, which is mainly required for buildings and maintenance. There's fuel cells, which help you produce key buildings like spice collectors and airfields. There's manpower, which is needed to produce and maintain units. And then, of course, being on a desert planet and all, there's water, which is important for keeping your people happy and feeding new villages. Then you have political resources. There's authority, which is the main currency used to capture new villages. There's influence, which is primarily used for voting on the Landsraad, which you can think of as the World Congress. There's intel, which is used for spy operations. More on those 2 later. And finally, there's knowledge, which is used for researching developments that improve your faction and grant you new abilities. Every village you capture can be improved with buildings that will give you some of these resources. They will have maintenance costs though, so you need to be careful to make sure you take it slow and keep your budget balanced. Overexpanding too eagerly and building too much too fast can very easily throw you out of whack, and you might find yourself with a resource deficit that will hit you with some pretty severe penalties. Because of this, I actually feel like Spice Wars is actually an economy and resource management game over anything else, and I think the economy management is much more important and maybe more difficult here than in any other 4X or RTS game I've personally ever played. I just want to reiterate again, making sure you have resources is super important, especially water. If you run low on water, your cities will begin to face unrest, and before you know it, you might have some rebellions on your hand. Having this surplus of resources will just act as a buffer for you before penalties really kick in, and if you're not careful, things can really spiral out of control as you lose access to key resources and villages. In the villages you take over, you're capable of recruiting militias who will be able to protect your lands. This is particularly important because there's going to be a lot of things threatening your control. Another thing you're going to have to deal with is raids from neutral sieges living on the planet. These guys will make their ways to your land and attempt to liberate villages you control. In general, these aren't too difficult to deal with, especially if you have militia, but the raids can definitely keep you from being as aggressive as you might want to be. Then of course you have to deal with enemy attacks. As you expand, your borders will naturally meet those of other factions. Obviously, since you're all competing for the same resources, you're going to be bound to have some battles with enemies. So here, let's talk about the combat system. When compared to other RTS games, Spice Wars is definitely much slower paced than most. Fights will usually last quite a while, especially at the default speed, but this does leave a lot of room for you to micromanage your units. Micro can be quite impactful too, as proper micro can keep low health units alive, help you manipulate what units the AI might target, help you focus down certain units, and make the most of your unit's passive abilities. It should be noted that fighting, or just motion in general on sand, will also attract sandworms, and so you'll want to be on the lookout for worm sign and micro your units to safety when necessary. I will say though, I wish there was more to the combat. For example, most unit abilities right now seem to be passive abilities, and I do think, given the slower paced nature of the combat, it would be nice to have more active abilities to give you more to do, and which could also help to swing battles and make things a little more unpredictable. I also do find that properly clicking on and targeting enemy units can be a bit finicky, especially if the enemy units are fighting in a village. I do like how it can be quite difficult to maintain control over your lands though, especially since I do feel like you need to expand quite wide if you want to be able to keep up with the ever-increasing spice tax. With a combination of rebellions and attacks from enemies, you'll often find yourself spread quite thin. As a result, you'll need to make extensive use of airfields, or in the case of the Fremen, sandworms, and these can help to transport units long distances quickly. This is particularly true because, whether intentional or not, I find that the AI is really good at coordinating attacks, which can be a bit annoying, but also a pretty fun challenge. Thankfully though, the map layouts have areas of deep desert which are very difficult for units to traverse, and so the map layout will create some natural choke points where you need to monitor and watch out for. Overall though, I really do like the core gameplay, and your empire will constantly feel like it's fluctuating as you sit on a precarious throne. So outside of the main 4X style of gameplay, there are a number of other really impactful systems which help to make the game feel more like a real political struggle. For one thing, trade can actually be a pretty major part of the game. Trade is especially useful if you find yourself in situations where you might start running into a deficit. You can very easily initiate trades with other factions for particular resources that you might need, and I think there's a really nice visual way that the game shows you how much a faction values a trade. Not only that, but trade value will fluctuate depending on how much of a reserve an AI has or how much it values that resource at the time. The main issues I want to point out here though are that, first, there currently isn't any way to counter trade offers from AI. I guess this isn't a huge issue, but sometimes I do like their offers and would like to tweak things a little bit just to send it back. Next, I feel like the AI doesn't always have an understanding of situations where trade is beneficial for them. For example, I had a case where an AI started an attack on my lands. I actually didn't have enough money to create more units or buildings at the time to help defend the attack, but I did manage to swing a trade with them to get some resources that I needed to push off the attack. Finally, and maybe most importantly, I feel like developing relationships with other factions can be quite difficult and could maybe use a bit more oomph. The more a faction likes a trade, the higher relationship level will increase as a result of the trade. However, if you really want to develop a relationship quickly, you'll need to take trades that might be heavily favored toward the AI, or maybe not in your best interest. Not only that, but I really don't like how if an AI attacks you, their view of you decreases, even though all you're really doing is defending your lands. I could be extensively trading with a faction, but then because of one fight, they suddenly hate me. I think that supposedly if your relationship is high, you're less likely to get attacked to begin with, but sometimes these fights are just out of your control. I also just wish there were more ways of influencing the relationship in general. Another major system, and one that I personally find quite fun, would have to be the spy intel system. Throughout the game, your faction will recruit spies. You can then assign these spies to other groups or factions in order to infiltrate their ranks and gain different boosts. For example, you can assign spies to infiltrate the Spacing Guild, one of the major organizations in the Dune universe. Doing so grants you additional manpower and intel, which is the intelligence currency that allows you to perform spy operations. You can also assign spies to infiltrate rival factions, and doing so will increase your view into their operations, including knowing what resources they have and their faction details. If you keep a spy infiltrated in a particular area, your infiltration level will steadily increase over time, granting you better bonuses and access to different spy missions. These spy missions will cost you intel and sometimes gold to prepare, and to conduct these missions there are required infiltration levels. Once the mission is prepared though, you then have it in your queue and you can use it in a zone of your choice. There's some pretty cool missions, and some of my favorites include crowd manipulation, which starts a rebellion in the targeted zone. I think this is just fun, especially just to mess with people. The supply drop is another one which I find very useful as it helps to provide heals and supply to your troops, making it easier to swing battles in your favor. And then ceasefire is another one you want to keep stocked, as it prevents an attack on a zone for an amount of time, buying you time to get your troops in place. Keep in mind though, AI also have access to these missions and they might be using them against you quite a lot. Then, one of the most important ones is the assassination mission. One of the victory types in Dune Spice Wars is the domination victory. This victory essentially entails you eliminating all enemies, whether by destroying their bases with your soldiers or assassinating them. I personally find assassinations quite difficult to pull off, which is both good and bad. To even begin an assassination attempt, you need to be quite infiltrated into multiple organizations and factions. This means to even get to that point, you need quite a few spies to begin with. Another important thing to note is that there are 3 stages of an assassination, with each stage becoming more and more expensive to initiate. As you go through each stage, you're also pretty much guaranteed to lose at least one spy, as they can be captured by the enemy, and you'll also run into situations where the enemy can counter-spy you and remove some of your infiltration level. As a result, I think that one assassination can be pretty difficult to pull off, let alone 3. At the same time though, I imagine if it were too easy to pull off, it might be ridiculously overpowered. Next, we have the Landsraad Council, which in the Dune universe essentially includes a number of major and minor houses with political sway in the Empire. You can think of the Landsraad vote as the World Congress you might see in Civ-style games. Every once in a while, a vote will come up in the Landsraad. There will be 3 resolutions in each vote, and you can assign votes between each of them. There are a variety of different resolutions, which either can be applied across all factions, or specifically target a faction. These resolutions can make quite a huge impact on how your game plays out as well. For example, there are resolutions which greatly increase the maintenance cost of certain resources. Getting hit by one of these can be brutal and easily send you into a deficit. There's also some other interesting ones, such as a resolution which grants you 3 free and very powerful units, and a resolution which boosts your spice exchange rate. Another major part of the Landsraad would have to be the charters. Over the course of the game, you'll find that there will be votes to award certain charters to factions. Essentially, when certain criteria are met by a faction, a vote can then be started to award a charter to the faction. So for example, there's a charter for the Water Sellers Union, which can be awarded to a faction with high levels of water generation. Everyone will then vote on whether or not to award that faction with the charter, and if they win, they'll gain specific bonuses related to the charter. The most important charter would have to be the Dune Governorship, which doesn't actually become available until fairly late in the game. Obtaining the Dune Governorship and holding it for a specified amount of time will lead to what's called a political victory. While I do like the idea of having this method of victory, I do think it could use some work. The biggest issue in my opinion would have to be the fact that it can feel a bit difficult to stop a political victory. There are actually Landsraad resolutions that remove active charters, but since you have no control over what resolutions appear, it's actually quite difficult to actually revoke governorship. Otherwise, I feel like the only other way would have to be eliminating that faction, but that might not always be a viable option. I actually had a case where someone was about to win a political victory, but when I sent my soldiers in, I literally could not do any damage to their base. I looked at the VOD again, and honestly, I'm not really sure why, but if anyone might know, please do let me know. So the main way you can swing your influence around in the Landsraad is actually through the influence resource. The Atreides and Harkonnens start off with Landsraad votes, which is based off their standing with the other houses. This standing, and thus the number of votes they have, can be affected by a couple of different things, with the main one being whether or not you're paying off your spice tax. The smugglers and Fremen start off with no Landsraad standing, but the smugglers are actually able to gain standing over the course of the game. Outside of that, you can also generate influence, which is actually a resource that allows you to cast more votes into resolutions than you would normally just through votes. All factions generate influence. The only thing I'll point out here is that there is a level of asymmetry here. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that the Atreides have a natural advantage when it comes to political victories, while the Fremen have a significantly harder time influencing the Landsraad. Finally, here I want to talk about the final victory type, the hegemony victory. Hegemony is essentially the victory point system in Spice Wars. You gain hegemony naturally from just playing the game. As you expand, you gain more, and there will be different key zones that might award extra hegemony as you capture them. Reaching different tiers of hegemony will also grant you different faction bonuses, so it's definitely going to be something you're going to want to increase across the game. Each faction might also have their own unique methods of gaining hegemony, which is a nice little touch to give each faction a bit of a different focus and feel. Of all the victory types, I feel like hegemony might be the most common and maybe the most balanced as well. So in this section, I just want to quickly rattle off some of my complaints or areas that I think could be improved in the game. These aren't all going to be at the same level, but I just wanted to list out some of the other things that I thought might not fit elsewhere. First, to an extent, I do feel like the factions could be made more unique. In particular, I think the design of the Fremen is a common talking point I've seen after the initial release. A lot of people seem to think that the design of the Fremen doesn't make much sense given that they are the natives of Arrakis. And while I do agree that given the nature of the Fremen in the books, it doesn't make sense for them to capture territory in the same way. I guess I personally just try to look at it as a united Fremen front. To be honest, I'm also not quite sure what else they could really do without changing the Fremen dramatically and making them very different from the other factions. I guess the idea that I personally thought of would be moving the Atreides' passive takeover ability to the Fremen, as it might make more sense for them to be able to peacefully convert villages. Outside of that, I do think that they could do more with the Dune universe as a whole. Right now, the main way we interact with any of the characters would be through the faction leaders and counselors. That's cool and all, but I feel like our relationship with these characters is pretty non-existent. I think it'd be really cool to add heroes or some other ways to interact with the counselors, and I think that Spice Wars Twitter even hinted that something might be in the works, so I'm really excited to see what they have there. I also just want to point out that the game is a bit more slow-paced in nature, and as a result, I can see some people not being huge fans. The 4x aspects of the game do make it a bit slower, and the fact that it's a real-time 4x does kind of accentuate this, as you might find yourself with quite a bit of downtime while waiting to generate enough resources to create new things or expand your lands. At the same time though, when there is action, it can actually be quite intense, even despite the slower pace. This wasn't a huge issue for me personally, as I barely paid attention to the downtime, but I can see that being a bit of a negative for some players. I also think that some of the quality of life stuff just isn't quite there yet. For example, I feel like I've seen people say that you can set unit waypoints and queue moves, but I feel like no matter what button combos I try, I just cannot get it to work. If this ability is actually in the game, I think it should be shown a lot better visually. I also wish that they had a hold position function or a way to give units more precise commands or orders. As of right now, units can be lured off into the desert and into worm territory, rather than just sitting and defending the village. They also actually have an event system in the game that will pop up with different events, and while I do think it's a nice touch and could use more events in general, my biggest complaint is actually the fact that there's no real notifications, and I think the notification system as a whole could be improved. Since you might be distracted at times by other things, you might not always notice when a Landsrat vote or an event is about to expire, and so I would have liked to have a more prominent notification letting you know, hey, this is the last chance you're going to get to submit this stuff. I think another thing to point out is that the game can be quite punishing. I did find that a few bad mistakes could easily lead to a downward spiral that goes out of control. If you lose your units in a bad fight or lose a key city, it can often result in your empire falling apart. Obviously this can be a fun challenge, but at the same time, it can feel a little bit bad. I personally have had to reload saves after some pretty bad beats. I also had the idea that maybe they should allow attacks across the map. What I mean by that is, the map in Spice Wars is a gigantic circle. When you reach the outside edges, you can no longer travel. The thing is, Arrakis is a planet, so it kinda doesn't make sense that you kinda just get stopped at the edges. I think it might be cool to allow us to attack across edges, like how you might circumnavigate the globe in Civ, and I do think that this could also kick up some of the action, but I do think it's a fairly minor point and not really one that they have to implement. I also just want to point out that in the current early access release, there is really only the sandbox available. There's no multiplayer yet, no campaign or story mode yet, although I'm sure they'll likely add those down the line. Finally, I just want to talk about the game length. I personally don't have any issues with it, especially as someone who's played a lot of Civ, but I can see the game length being a turnoff for some players. The typical game for me took around 3 to 5 hours depending on the game speed you play at and how much you pause, but I have actually seen that some people are capable of winning the game in under an hour if they really try. Again, not really a huge issue for me personally, but some people might not really enjoy that. Alright, and finally let's talk about the technical stuff. The graphics are solid, although maybe could be improved a bit. I think Arrakis itself looks really good, although it could maybe use a bit more flavor here and there. I do really like the portraits and art for the leaders and counselors though, and it does seem to take inspiration from the new Dune movie. I like the sound design overall as well. I do hope they add more tracks though, as you'll likely be hearing a lot of the same music across a 5-hour game. Meanwhile, the sound effects are fine, nothing particularly special to be honest, but still fairly satisfying and distinct enough for you to begin to recognize certain cues. The only thing I'll bring up here is the fact that I have run into some minor bugs, mainly around unit pathing and AI units just standing there, but it's early access, so I'm going to assume that most of these should be addressed by the time the game is released. Overall though, I gotta say, I do feel like Dune Spice Wars is a pretty polished experience for an early access game. Obviously it still has a lot of room to grow, but based on what I've played so far, I'm very hopeful for the game. I think Dune Spice Wars has a really solid base, and with some more time in the oven, it could be a lot of fun. Since the game is still in very early access, I'm not going to give the game a score just yet. Honestly though, at only $30, I think it's a pretty solid price. Obviously, I think most people will probably want to wait for more updates and content to justify paying that price, but if you're into strategy games, I do think this could be a pretty unique entry for your library. But hey, that's just me. Have you tried Dune Spice Wars and what'd you think of it? And of course, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider hitting that like and subscribe button for more. And as usual, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.